Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 10 video, and we're going over gender and stratification. So, without further ado, I have announcements, review, and lecture, ending with our exit pass and reminders. I'm up to date with all my grading. For your midterm exam, you should have a grade with feedback on eLearn for that assignment. Or if you don't have a grade, that means I sent you an email following up with you. You might need to do extensive revisions. You might have a recording or a PowerPoint presentation link that wasn't working for me. There's a variety of reasons why students may not have a grade and have an email from me instead. So make sure you're following up with me as soon as possible so we can address any challenges, technical or otherwise, you may have been experiencing, and then we can sort of go from there and I can finalize your grade as soon as possible. I'm also finished up grading with all of your weekly assignments. So the most recent weekly assignment you completed is from week 8. It's the study guide that goes with the Shirley Chisholm documentary. So make sure you're looking to see your score for that assignment as well. All right. And then in terms of new assignments, your group project outline is due at the end of this week, Sunday at 11:59 p.m. You should have a little bit of time in class, actually a good amount of time in class this coming Thursday, so week 10 Thursday, to meet with your group mates and sort of go over everything in anticipation of that due date later in the week. So make sure when you come to class this week, week 10, you are prepared to discuss the group project outline. And then if your group is sort of finished or almost finished with the group outline, you should use the remainder of class time to start working on the actual project. So you might work on the PowerPoint, you might come up with a day and time where you're able to record the assignment, whatever you want to do in order to prepare your final product for your group project would be appropriate. But expect to stay in class until the end, because even if you are further along in your group project outline, you still need to continue working on the other part of your group project, which is the PowerPoint and the podcast. And then, of course, if you need to make up any classes you've missed or you plan on missing in the near future, consider going to the Our American Journey exhibit on campus. You complete the scavenger hunt, which is a worksheet that they'll give you. And then in order to get credit for going to that exhibit, you submit the scavenger hunt worksheet to me, okay? If you have any questions, comments, or things you want to share with your classmates, make sure you're coming prepared for our Thursday evening session to do that. As far as exit pass answers, the majority of what your class talked about this past week, so week 8, since we didn't have class for week 9. It was spring break. A lot of folks just talked about what your plans were for spring break. And you also asked final questions related to upcoming assignments. So if you did that and you included your name, I followed up with you via email right before or at the beginning of spring break. And then if you didn't include your name, make sure you're following up with me after class on Thursday or via email so that we can touch base regarding any questions you may have asked in the exit pass. All right, so review. The last thing we did before spring break is we watched the documentary about Shirley Chisholm, Unbought and Unbossed, and her run for presidency in 1972. You should have followed along completing your study guide, and then you should have uploaded your completed study guide for 10 points, and that counts toward your week 8 weekly assignment. So make sure you're following up with me at the beginning of our in-person class on Thursday evening if you have any final questions about that documentary or about that assignment. All right, in terms of new content, this week we're focusing on chapter 12, which hones in on stratification as it relates to gender and sexuality. So, as far as key terms from our textbook, we start off by going over the difference between sex and gender. Now, when I first started teaching intro classes in the fields of sociology, women's and gender studies, and criminal justice, students didn't always come in with a baseline understanding of what the difference was between sex and gender. But I would say increasingly students actually come to my classes with that understanding. If you don't know, though, the sort of surface level way of differentiating between sex and gender is that sex is biological and gender is social. Your textbook definitions are: sex is a term rooted in biology and most often based upon reproductive organs, versus gender is a term that refers to social or cultural distinctions of behaviors based on one's sex assigned at birth. Now, often people will think sex in particular is binary, you're either male or female, but we actually know that there are some other options, biologically speaking. And so actually sex and gender, neither of those terms are binary, meaning, you have two options. These things exist on a spectrum, and we'll talk more about that, or I guess I'll talk more about that at the end of this lecture. But for now, if we're thinking about sex and biology, the sort of main third option is intersex, which is people born with sex characteristics, including genitals and chromosome patterns that do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. And so there's a really great documentary that last time I checked was streaming on Amazon Prime, and it's called Intersection. It has an X in that word because it's about the experiences of people who are intersex. They interview various people who are intersex from different age groups, different parts of the country, who have had different experiences with being biologically intersex. Some folks have really traumatic experiences where medical professionals tried to do multiple operations on them to quote unquote fix their reproductive organs. However, some folks did not have that experience and actually didn't even find out that they were intersex until they were adults, until later in life. And so it's interesting to see how things like age, geographic location, socioeconomic status, and gender expression all factor into the types of experiences folks have when they are intersex. And then another fun stats that I like to quote from this documentary is the fact that the amount of people born intersex globally is approximately the same percentage of people who are born with red hair. And of course, you all know I have red hair, so it's kind of a fun fact or an interesting statistic related to the intersex community. And so that just shows you it's actually much more common than people probably think. However, a lot of folks don't even learn until later in life that they're intersex. So it's kind of interesting to see that even though there is a decent percentage of our population, we don't necessarily talk about it. And of course, it's much more taboo than, say, talking about having red hair, right? And then the last thing I want to say about sex versus gender is we've touched on this a little bit already in our class, but I often talk about a study that was published in a scholarly journal article in the late 1980s, where the authors analyzed biology textbooks that are being used in high schools across the country. And they look at how biology textbook authors are writing about reproduction. They look at how the egg and the sperm are being written about in biology textbooks. And so we know that even though biology is often perceived as being this unbiased, ungendered thing, as so many of the natural sciences often are, actually the language being used to write about reproduction in biology textbooks is incredibly gendered. And so in these biology textbooks, the authors show us how the sperm is often written about in sort of very historically, traditionally masculine ways, where it's sort of saving the passive egg, it's the aggressor. And then eggs are, of course, talked about in very feminine ways, where they're the passive one. When in fact, the way that reproduction looks, there is no gendered way of things happening. The egg and the sperm just exist and sort of do what they do, right? And so that's just this idea that we do gender, or we apply gender to all aspects of our lives, even things that we think are unbiased or free from gendered ways of existing, like biology and the natural sciences. Next, your textbook authors hone in on the experiences of the LGBTQ plus community. And so they define various terms related to that. So transgender is an adjective that describes individuals who identify with the behaviors and characteristics that are different than their biological sex. Here we also have to talk about cisgender, which is a label for those folks who do identify with the sex they were assigned with at birth. Often, when we talk about a marginalized community, we tend to only think about the label for that group. But we can also think about the privileged group as well. And so when it comes to transgender, the sort of other side of that coin is being cisgender, where you do, in fact, identify with the sex you were assigned with at birth. In terms of the LGBTQ plus community in Chapter 12, we learn about gender identity, which is a person's deeply held internal perception of one's own gender. And then we have sexual orientation, which is a person's physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction to a particular sex, either male or female. Now, there are a lot more nuances to some of these terms than what is offered in Chapter 12, and so I'll talk about that at the end of today's lecture. Gender roles are society's concepts of how men and women should behave. And again, we've talked a lot about that throughout the semester because we're constantly going back to this discussion of race, class, and gender. So I won't belabor the point here, and I'll jump right into doing gender, which is the performance of tasks based upon the gender assigned to us by society and in turn ourselves. And so I already touched on this a little bit when I talked about the biology textbook study. But I'll go on to say that this is a term, a theory coined by Weston Zimmerman in 1987, and it continues to get used theoretically in contemporary sociological research related to gender because it's still so relevant. It's this sort of micro understanding of how gender exists and all these different ways and shapes and forms in our everyday lived experiences. And that in turn influences what gender looks like structurally within social institutions. So, sort of making that connection between micro and then macro aspects of gender and how it plays out in all these different ways in our social world. Glass ceiling is an invisible barrier that women encounter when trying to win jobs in the highest level of businesses. So we've talked a little bit about representation, especially in mainstream ways. Certainly, if we recall the documentary we watched about Shirley Chisholm and her bid for presidency in 1972, we can see how that plays out, right? So even as women have increasing access to positions of leadership and power, especially after the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 1970s, we know that the higher up we go in terms of positions of power and leadership, we start to see less and less representation from historically marginalized communities, including women. So again, thinking about the example of elected politicians and Shirley Chisholm, at the local, smaller scale level, we see more and more women getting elected to politics. Take Dayton, Ohio, for example, where many of you all live. The new mayor is a woman. And then we start to take it up one more tier and we look at states. There are fewer and fewer women in governorship positions. I believe it was Virginia just elected their first female governor recently. And that really shocked me because you think of that as being a level of elected officialness that women have sort of conquered, but not necessarily in all states. And then, of course, we can think about the bid for presidency that Shirley Chisholm had in 1972 and how unusual and rare that was. You know, she was really the first woman and the first person of color to run for the highest level of office in the United States. And of course, we know what the discourse nationally looked like when Hillary Clinton ran for presidency not too long ago, right? And so thinking about how women, the higher up you get in positions of power and leadership in various professions, there are fewer and fewer women. That's the glass ceiling. Now, another term we have to talk about is almost the opposite of that, and that's the glass elevator. It's this idea that in female-dominated professions, when we see men in those spaces, they tend to sort of go up the ladder in terms of positions of power and leadership at a much higher rate than their female counterparts. So if you think about, for example, a profession like nursing, which is still pretty female dominated and historically always has been, when you see men in nursing, they tend to more quickly become shift supervisors and, people in positions of power and leadership within the field of nursing. And so you have the glass ceiling for women and the glass elevator for men. We've talked again throughout the semester about how a lot of our identity categories like race, class, and gender are socially constructed, but your textbook authors talk about the social construction of sexuality in chapter 12, which is defined as socially created definitions about the cultural appropriateness of sex-linked behavior, which shape how people see and experience sexuality. And so we all, all societies, all cultures sort of have this basic social construction of sexuality. But our ideas about what sexuality should look like might vary in different parts of the country or in different parts of the world. Heterosexism is an ideology and a set of institutional practices that privilege straight people and heterosexuality over other sexual orientations. Now, at this point in the lecture, I always like to point out that even when we see same-sex couples and more diversity in terms of LGBTQ plus representation in mainstream institutions, in movies and TV shows and that sort of thing, often heterosexism is still applied to same-sex couples. If you think about a problematic question that you'll often hear in movies and TV shows, like something along the lines of who's the man and who's the woman in a relationship between two men or two women, that's rooted in heterosexism. This idea that all couples should have two people and one of them should be more masculine and one of them should be more feminine. In reality, there are many straight couples who don't adhere to those sort of traditional notions of masculinity and femininity. And certainly there are many queer couples who also don't adhere to that, where both partners can be more masculine and both partners can be more feminine. But yet in mainstream portrayal of queer couples, there tends to be this heterosexism applied. Homophobia is an extreme or irrational oversight to gay, lesbian, bisexual, or all LGBTQ plus people, which often manifests as prejudice and bias. Now, when we did our unit on stratification and race, we talked about examples of how racism plays out institutionally in social institutions such as the criminal justice system. The same is also true when we think about structural issues related to gender and sexuality. And so we sort of touched on this a little bit the last couple of weeks. I think someone in our class used don't ask, don't tell in the military as an example of policy that's inherently biased. And that's certainly a good example for chapter 12, where we're talking about gender and sexuality. Policies that prevent gay men from donating blood because of stigma and misconceptions around gay men and AIDS, that would be another example. And then another thing I want to point out is, although the LGBTQ plus community is part of the protected class when it comes to hate crimes within the criminal justice system, there have been instances in, our lifetimes where a thing called gay panic has been held up in a court of law. And so essentially what has happened is, although the prosecution has been able to prove without a shadow of a doubt that a crime was committed against a victim because of their LGBTQ plus identity, which can be pretty hard to do, by the way, because someone can always claim, oh, I didn't know that person was part of the LGBTQ plus community. So although I did commit this crime, it was random. I didn't do it because of that identity. So in situations where it has been proven that was why, there have been instances where people have either not been convicted or gotten off with sort of a warning because their defense has argued that they found out this person was gay or trans or queer, and they panicked and acted out violently toward that victim. So we see all these institutional ways in which sexism and homophobia continue to play out structurally within social institutions. Another thing I want to point out is, so I was finding an image for the purpose of today's lecture for this slide, and I wanted to depict same-sex couples. So you can see there's wedding cake toppers here with two women and two men. And I thought it was interesting that The two men are much more pronounced than the two women who are sort of blurred and in the background. I think that's very indicative of what LGBTQ plus representation tends to look like, especially in mainstream spaces. If you think about the media and TVs and movies and that sort of thing. One of the first mainstream TV shows that depicted gay characters was Will and Grace in the early 2000s. At that time, it was still men, usually white, from an affluent background who were good looking. And so, even as we see more queer couples represented in mainstream spaces, in a lot of ways, they still have a lot of privilege, right? And so, women and other queer folks who have other historically marginalized identities tend to still be on the peripheral when we think about social institutions and representation. All right, so that's sort of it in terms of textbook definitions from chapter 12. In order to provide a little bit more clarity, I want to introduce you to the gender unicorn figure. And so this just shows us that various identities that fall under the umbrella category of the LGBTQ plus community are non-binary and exist on a spectrum. So you can see here gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who someone's physically attracted to, and who someone's emotionally attracted to. These are not binary either or categories. They exist on a spectrum where people can have multiple identity categories. And then the other thing I like to point out is that these things are not inherently connected to each other. I think sometimes there's this misconception that the way someone expresses their gender automatically is connected to who they're physically or emotionally attracted to. If you think about this sort of archaic idea that we still often see portrayed in movie and TV shows of quote unquote someone having a good gaydar, you can tell by looking at someone what their gender identity and or sexual orientation is. That's based off of assumptions people make about gender expression, right? But we know a man can present more feminine in their gender expression, or a woman can express their gender more masculinely. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, right? And so that's a really important thing to touch on. And I think it's interesting because more and more Gen Zers, especially, are really good at sort of playing with gender expression. If you think about someone famous like Harry Styles, he'll wear a skirt on the red carpet or a string of pearls in a magazine shoot, right? And then other hypermasculine men see that and they admire him, they think he's cool, and so they also adopt those styles and sort of play with gender expression, even though they probably don't identify as being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. So I think that young people tend to have a more nuanced understanding of the fact that these things are not inherently connected to each other, although certainly there can be some connections. All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the fact that the reason why we have the gender unicorn figure and not the genderbread figure, which I can show you in class on Thursday night if anyone is interested, is because the gender bread figure was actually plagiarized. So someone actually found it on the internet, cleaned it up a little bit, passed it off as their own, and plagiarized it. So this is a cautionary tale of the fact that anyone can plagiarize. I think sometimes people think that's something only students do, but actually that's not true. Anyone can do it. And I think there's also this misunderstanding that plagiarism only happens in written assignments like papers. But anytime you try to pass off something as your own when it's not, and you don't give the original creator credit, that's plagiarism. And so you can see here, I have information about where I got this image from. Make sure when you're submitting PowerPoint slides or any work for any of your classes, including mine, you give that credit. And so even if your in-text citations or your reference page isn't properly formatted, we can figure that out as long as it's there in the first place. That's the most important thing. All right, here's your exit pass link. I'll also send it out at the end of our in-person class on Thursday, same link. And then as far as reminders, finish reading chapter 12 on gender and sexuality. Start reading chapter 14 and 15 in preparation for next week, week 11. Work on your group outline. This assignment is due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Remember, only one person in each group needs to submit this assignment on eLearn. That's why it's so important for you to identify your individual contribution on that group document. You can color code who's contributing what. You can put a little hyphen in your name after each section you added. However, you want to make that distinction is fine with me as long as it's clear, because people do have the ability to earn an individual grade for the group assignment. And then the last thing I'll say about that is once the person from your group that's supposed to upload the group outline has done so, I strongly encourage you to send a confirmation email to me, CCing all of your group mates. Just something along the lines of, hey, Dr. L, this is so and so, and I am confirming that I submitted the group outline on behalf of, list all the people in your group, and that it was submitted on eLearn by the due date. Then I'll reply all and I'll say, yes, I received your group outline on eLearn by the appropriate due date. Or if there are any issues and I'm not able to access your document for whatever reason, I'll also reply all so everyone in your group can see that. Hopefully everything is in good shape, and that just sort of gives your group mates peace of mind that they have confirmation from me as the instructor that their part of the group outline has been submitted properly on time. Alternatively, if there are any issues with the submission, by CCing all of your group mates and me replying all, let's say the issue is that you submitted your group outline as a Google Doc link, and I click on that link and there's restricted access because you forgot to give me access. If I reply all and you're away from your computer, but one of your group mates is able to share access to that file with me sooner, that just sort of helps with the process and allows me to finalize your grade sooner, right? So it benefits everyone for you to send that email, CCing all of your group mates to get confirmation from me that your group outline has in fact been submitted on time, and you will be eligible for full credit for that assignment. Other than that, email me with any follow-up questions you might have. I'll see you all Thursday. Have a great week. Bye, everyone.